absolutely right. I think those are the five most famous words he has said and will say, and that communicated not only to gays and lesbians, but really to everyone who's felt disenchanted or separated from the church. You're welcome, right? And this is no longer a person from whom you're going to hear condemnations or judgment. It's all about mercy and compassion. The great theme of his papacy is mercy, so I agree with you.
The great theme is mercy. One of the big questions, Koki, is what is the lingering effect going to be? So many disaffected Catholics here in the United States. The population of disaffected Catholics almost as large as the population of churchgoing.
Well, we don't at the moment have measurable Francis effect, although the Jesuits say that they've gotten more people interested in joining the order. Whether they've actually done it or not is another question. But it can't hurt. And people are giving the church another look, as you cited the ABC poll about more people think that it's in touch. And this question of mercy is so important. I mean, he said that a woman who's had an abortion can go to confession to her local priest and be forgiven instead of going to the bishop and having some impossible thing for her. And his compassionate words about that were so moving, where he said for these women it's often an existential question and they're in terrible pain as they make this decision. So it was not just saying, he was not saying abortion's all right, quite the contrary, saying you have to confess. But he was also saying you can be forgiven, and I understand that you might be in an awful position.
Well, he's trying to move a church that was a church and felt of judgment to a church of mercy and understanding. Right. I find it fascinating. He leads a hierarchical institution that every step he makes is breaking it down. The hierarchical institution is that he's trying to push power outward. He's trying to give more power to local. He's trying to let them develop where they are. And I think that's, for a person that heads an institution, he's actually transforming that institution.
And that gets to a question for you, Father Martin. How much do you think the cardinals who, I hesitate to say they chose him because the Holy Spirit, according to church doctrine, chooses the Pope, but do you think they got what they expected?
I don't think he's what they expected. I think they expected someone, they knew Cardinal Bergoglio from Buenos Aires as someone who was an apostle of the poor, someone who could get things done, who could clean up the Vatican, but they didn't expect this revolution, they didn't expect the outreach, they didn't expect the sort of transformation, as you were saying, and I always say they forgot they elected a Jesuit.
Well, that's the transformation of the church, but I wonder if you could speak for a moment also about the transformation in the Pope himself. You know, by reputation for all of his years in Argentina, something of a dour man, not known for this man of exceptional warmth and reaching out. And now you see him all the time, a huge smile on his face.
Well, and they say that friends of mine who know him say that, in fact, when he was cardinal in Buenos Aires, he was always devoted to the poor and a hard worker and very pious. But this warm and sort of fuzzy and almost physical side where he's happy embracing people is new. And the Pope has said to friends that, he felt something come over him when he was elected. And, we call it the grace of office in the Catholic Church. And he's transformed. And I always say that, the night he was elected, when you bow your head and ask 1 billion people to pray over you, something's going to happen. And something did.
Cardinal Wuerl here, the Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, said yesterday he was one of the electors. And he was asked that question of, were you surprised? And he said, well, the first surprise was him taking the name Francis, and that's when we got an understanding of we were in for something of a ride.
Terry Moran, you've been traveling the Pope, you've been covering the Pope as our chief foreign correspondent as well. I mentioned this a bit with Father Martin earlier, but we know the Pope doesn't do too many interviews. He did that press conference with you all, brief one, on the plane. In part, we know also, as he comes to the United States, he's not really comfortable with English at all, but he's been practicing it quite hard, especially on these set speeches that he's going to give at the Congress and at the White House tomorrow.
He is going to speak in English here, but from a written text, George. He was asked today in his question and answer session with us in the back of the plane before they served the dinner, or the lunch, I should say. I've lost track of time. Would you take a question in English? And the Pope says, no. He says, English is not my strong suit. It's not my strong point. But he will read texts in English because, after all, he's trying to connect with Americans. I mean, he's got this tightrope that you all are talking about that he has to walk between pushing this progressive-sounding social agenda that he has and keeping traditional Catholics on board who fear, as he was directly asked, that he may not still be 100% a Catholic.
And Father Martin, Martin, he has faced some resistance. You see the president leaving Andrews now with the Pope from Andrews Air Force Base. He has faced some resistance from the hierarchy in the church and from some of the faithful.
He has, I think, more from some of the faithful. I mean, Jesus faced resistance, and, the Pope is saying some hard truths, particularly about income inequality, the way we treat the environment, the way we treat migrants. And, I think whenever you talk about income and the poor, it's a threat to some of the powerful people, and I think he understands that, and that goes with the territory.
Of course, Koki, the sexual abuse scandal here in the United States, also such a scar, and had disaffected so many Catholics. A lot of people will be watching to see what the Pope says about that.
Absolutely right, and whether he meets with victims of sex abuse. It was not only a moral scar, a huge moral scar, but an economic one. And here's a Pope who's saying that, the poor should be taken care of, and millions of dollars that could have been spent for the poor have been spent on legal suits, which is appalling, basically.
A lot of archbishops and bishops as well, Father Martin, almost shamed by some of their excess.
Well, I think when you see the Pope driving his little crummy car and living in his tiny little apartment, I think it calls all of us to try to live simply. I mean, I feel the same way. We were talking in my community the other night about how he has encouraged everybody to live a more simple lifestyle, which is appropriate. That's one of his roles as a moral leader.
And that's a place where he seems to have made an impact, George. In the Pew Research study, more than 60% of Catholics said that they thought reaching out to the poor and taking care of the poor was an essential component of Catholicism. And I'm not sure that would have been true.
And I think it's going to be one of the lasting impacts of his papacy, is he said it's going to be very hard for another pope to put the red shoes back on. Once you take the red shoes off, it's very hard to go back to extravagance.
I hope so.
And there you see it, and sort of proves your point. Father Martin, the Pope getting into a pretty simple Fiat car right there. I'm sure it'll have all the necessary protections.
Yeah, he does try to live.
Looks like he's squeezing in there, though.
Yeah, he's, no, I've heard it is true, as Terry was saying, he has put on a lot of weight.
Italian cooks.
That's right, all that pasta in the hostel. But, a friend of mine told me who works in the Vatican that the Pope was late for a meeting once because he said, I got held up at the red light. He was driving his own little crummy car. And so this is someone who is used to that. He was used to taking the subway in Buenos Aires as a Jesuit. He took a vow of poverty. He owned nothing. And this is who he is. And I think it's a great thing to bring to the papacy.
Father Martin, it's one of the reasons it's so interesting for a Jesuit to be Pope. Of course, for a time, the papacy had outlawed Jesuits. Mm-hmm. But didn't St. Ignatius, your founder, say that Jesuits shouldn't even be bishops?
Yeah, we make a promise at our final vows never to strive for or ambition any high office in the church. We promise that publicly. And we also promise if we see any other Jesuit striving for that, we are to turn him in.
Riding in a Fiat? Is that what I just said? Riding in a Fiat.
That's great.
That's awesome.
And it's rolling now into Washington, D.C. Yeah, that is not something you're used to seeing right there.
It must be very cramped.
It's fantastic. Once again, he is teaching by gestures, and he knows what he's doing. It not only flows out of him naturally, but it also teaches.
So how does it work if you're not supposed to strive for higher office and then the leader of the church is a Jesuit?
Well, what happens is frequently the Pope calls upon Jesuits to become bishops, and we're supposed to accept only under pain of sin. That is, the Pope has to order us to become bishops. That's how he became a bishop, Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and then they elected him. And one of the big jokes in the Jesuits was, well, who's the superior now? Is it the Jesuit superior or the Pope? And the Jesuit superior in Rome said, yes, he is the superior.
Of course, the first American bishop, John Carroll, was a Jesuit, and he had to give up his Jesuit status to become a bishop, the first bishop of the United States of America.
The Pope with a final wave of the crowd there as he rolls out of Andrews Air Force Base, heading into Washington, D.C. Packed schedule ahead over the next several days here in the United States. Tomorrow morning at the White House. He'll be greeted formally at the White House by the president. They will both speak